So factors which determine the entry and exit criteria of testing are acquisition and supply. So for example, availability of resources, be it the testers or hardware resources or software resources. So this is one factor that affects entry and exit criteria of the testing phase. For example, you do not have hardware and software resources for setting up the test environment, definitely you cannot enter the testing phase. So acquisition and supply or availability of resources is one factor that determines entry criteria and exit criteria of the testing. For example, testing resources are less, then it will affect the entry criteria as well. If you have no testers available or you need to build a team, then you need to delay the testing entry criteria. You need to delay the test phase entry time accordingly. Then test items is another factor for determining entry and exit criteria. So the state in which test item should be before starting or ending test execution. For example, when you start the test execution, the build that you get from developers should pass build verification test. That's an entry criteria for an test item, the build that you are going to test. And exit criteria can be for the build, there is no severity 1 or severity 2 defect remaining for that specific build. So the test items define, that's another factor for determining entry and exit criteria. Third is the defects or bugs. So total defects found in that particular release, test release, how many have been fixed, how many are still remaining, what was the defect detection rate, how many defects were kind of deferred. So all this information is also a factor to determine whether we can enter a next phase of testing or exit the current phase of testing. For example, if you are doing a functional testing and there are still 10 severity 1 defects need to be fixed, you cannot exit functional testing phase and enter into system testing phase. So defects and bugs also determine the entry and exit criteria of the testing. The other factor is the test cases. So total test cases that have been executed, total passed, failed, or blocked, or skipped. So if you had planned 200 test cases for functional testing phase and you have only executed 150 till now, you cannot exit this functional testing phase and enter into system testing phase. So number of test cases being executed, number of test cases passed, failed, this is also a factor to determine whether you can enter or exit the current phase and enter into the next phase. Then the coverage, so percentage of test bases covered by testing or code coverage. So if your entry criteria says that your functional testing phase should have code coverage of at least 80%, or the unit testing phase should have the coverage of more than 90%, then you cannot release a build. The developers cannot release a build unless and until the code coverage reaches more than 90%. So coverage is another entry and exit criteria for testing. Then the quality is another factor. So status of important quality characteristics of software. So for example, you have set of 5 quality characteristics that you have defined in the plan. If those quality characteristics are being met, then you will exit the test phase. If those are not met, then you cannot exit that phase and enter into another phase. Then money and budget. So cost of finding defects in current execution or after in production. That's another exit criteria that that has to be taken into account. So For example, is it good to exit the system testing phase or user acceptance testing phase and go into production when you know that there are still a lot of defects being found in end-to-end scenarios? So there needs to be some kind of exit criteria defined, which will make sure that once you go into the production environment, once the software is deployed in production environment, you do not get a lot of defects, because cost of finding defects will be very high once the software is in production. So money and budget are other factors for determining entry and exit criteria. Then the risks. So any undesirable outcomes shipped with some untested features or loss in the market share if shipped too late. So risks is another factor. So if there is a huge revenue loss if the software is released very late, then there will be an exit criteria based on the risk of losing the market share. It will be decided that we can end the testing and we can release in the market. So if risk is high, then we'll plan accordingly to that. So risk is another factor for determining the entry exit criteria. So let's see a bit more about entry and exit criteria. So the entry criteria helps you to decide when can you start the testing for a product testing phase. So for example, if you are in functional testing phase, it will decide, the entry criteria will decide when you can start testing for functional testing phase. Then the exit criteria helps you to decide when to stop the testing for that particular phase. For example, you entered into a functional testing phase, then when can you leave the functional testing phase? So entry criteria for functional testing phase could be that your build that is delivered by the developers passes build verification test. There is no critical defect. There are no build failures in the build that you get from the development team. That's a simple entry criteria for functional testing. Exit criteria for functional testing could be no severity 1 and severity 2 defects are open in functional testing phase. They are all fixed and retested. So that could be exit criteria for functional testing. So exit criteria helps you to decide when can you leave functional testing phase and enter into systems testing phase. Then the exit criteria from one stage forms part of the entry criteria into the next testing phase. So entry criteria, exit criteria of one phase forms an entry criteria into the next testing phase. If the testing will exit from functional testing, it means it is ready to enter into system testing phase. So exit criteria from one phase, that is functional, will decide whether you can enter into the next phase, that is system or any other phase of the testing. Then entry exit criteria are the true quality checks of the actual software testing. So these entry and exit criteria are very important, and these are the actual quality checks that you mention in your plan and adhere to, because these are the actual quality checks which make sure that your software is of good quality. Now, typical entry criteria for a testing phase may consist of, for example, build verification test passed, that is, you are getting a stable build. Then availability of required test data and test environment. So if test environment and test data is available, all hardware and software resources that are required to start the testing are available, all the testing resources are available, all the testers are ready to get started, then that can be another entry criteria to start the testing. And whether all the required test documents are completed and signed off. For example, all the test plan strategy has been completed and signed off, test cases have been designed and documented and entered into the test management tool and are ready. So once all these documents are completed and approved, then that can be another entry criteria for starting the test phase. Then what can be the exit criteria? Some examples. So typical exit criteria for a test phase may include factors like total coverage has been attained. For example, if you're into unit testing phase, so if the exit criteria says the statement coverage for unit testing phase should be more than 95%, then whether that criteria has been achieved by the unit testing that is done by developers. If that is achieved, then they'll exit. If that is not achieved, then they'll add more test cases to achieve that coverage level that is mentioned into the exit criteria. Then there are no outstanding defects, so there should be no outstanding severity 1 and severity 2 defects in the build. All the defects should be fixed and retested by the test team. And if there are any cost and time constraints, time to market is more important, that can be another exit criteria. And there should be no critical residual risks in the product. So for example, there are 5 critical modules of the product which should not have any residual risk or any critical risk after the testing. Then you can exit the testing phase. These are some of the exit criteria.